Imagine, imagine for a second that your smartphone just suddenly dies. The screen just goes black.
Right. The absolute worst case scenario for most of us.
Seriously.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't immediately throw it in the trash, right? You wouldn't assume the internal processors are permanently destroyed or that all your photos are just gone forever.
No, I mean, you'd probably just assume the battery drained. You'd look for a wall outlet to plug it in.
Exactly. You look for a charger.
Yeah.
But when it comes to memory loss, dementia, Alzheimer's, we tend to treat the brain like a phone that has been smashed with a hammer.
That is a very good point.
We view it as this one-way street of irreversible structural damage. Like
Yeah.
the hardware is broken, the files are deleted, and those brain cells are just, well, they're gone.
Yeah, and that view of neurodegeneration as a permanent deletion process that has been the foundational understanding for decades, it is incredibly pervasive.
Right.
The assumption is just that by the time cognitive decline becomes apparent to you or your family, the neurons are either dead or so severely compromised that they're basically beyond saving.
But today, we are looking at a breakthrough that asks a completely staggering question. What if those brain cells aren't permanently broken? What if they just need to be plugged in?
It's fascinating.
It really is. So we are pulling from a May 16th, 2026 Science Daily article that breaks down this massive study published in Nature Neuroscience. And this research was led by an international team from INSERM, the University of Bordeaux, and the Université de Moncton in Canada.
A really heavy-hitting group of institutions.
Totally. And the mission for our deep dive today with you, our listener, is to explore this radically different angle on cognitive decline. We're going to look at how scientists are finding ways to recharge the brain's tiny cellular engines and how that might completely reshape our approach to memory loss.
Because it really is a profound shift in perspective. For a very long time, the scientific community has been locked in this debate about the exact sequence of events that lead to cognitive decline.
Right, the timeline of it all.
Exactly. But this research gives us a first-of-its-kind discovery. It provides hard proof of a direct cause and effect link between an energy failure inside the cell and the actual symptoms of neurodegenerative diseases.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if a brain cell is just lacking power, that implies the cell is still fundamentally alive.
Yes.
It implies that the capacity for memory, for forming thoughts, is still sitting right there, locked inside the tissue, just waiting for a spark to come back online.
Which is incredibly hopeful.
It is. But to really grasp how these researchers are trying to reverse memory loss, we have to zoom way in. We're moving from the broad concept of dementia down to the microscopic power grid inside our cells. So we need to talk about mitochondria.
Right, mitochondria. They are often called the power plants of the cell, which is accurate, but it perhaps understates their complexity a bit.
How so?
Well, they're highly dynamic structures. They're responsible for generating the chemical energy required for almost every single cellular function. And when we look at the brain, their role is elevated to a critical level.
Because the brain needs so much energy.
A massive amount. The brain is only about 2% of a human's body weight, yet it consumes roughly 20% of the body's total energy.
So it's an absolute energy hog.
It has to be. Neurons depend on this uninterrupted supply of mitochondrial energy to maintain their electrical charge, to release neurotransmitters, and to send signals across these vast networks.
So everything we do up there requires power.
Every time you form a memory or, recognize a face, your neurons are firing off rapid-fire electrical impulses that demand huge amounts of power.
Let's bring this back to the smartphone analogy for you listening right now. Think of a neuron trying to send a signal to form a new memory, kind of like you trying to send a text message.
Right.
If your phone battery drops to 1%, the physical hardware is still intact. The screen isn't cracked, the chips are fine, the data is still there. But when you hit send, the message fails.
Because the device lacks the physical power required to actually transmit the signal, the failure is in the power supply, not the structural integrity. And according to these researchers, a very similar phenomenon occurs in the brain. When the activity of the mitochondria drops, the neurons simply can't generate enough energy to fire their signals effectively.
And over time, that communication breakdown manifests as the memory and thinking problems that we typically associate with dementia.
Precisely.
But wait, I have to play devil's advocate here. Just because energy drops at the same time a patient loses their memory, That doesn't necessarily mean the energy drop is the cause, right? Like, if a building is burning down, the power is going to go out.
Right, of course.
But that doesn't mean the power outage caused the fire.
What's fascinating here is that you've just highlighted the very core of the chicken or egg debate that has frustrated Alzheimer's researchers for decades.
Oh, really? So this is a known issue.
Oh, absolutely. Scientists have known for a long time that mitochondrial problems appear right alongside neuronal degeneration. In fact, these energy deficits routinely show up long before the brain cells actually die.
So the debate was whether the dying batteries were causing the Alzheimer's or if the disease itself was just, I don't know, destroying the cell's internal machinery as a side effect.
That was the main hurdle. If the energy drop is merely a side effect, like a symptom of a cell that is already dying from other causes, then trying to fix the energy wouldn't actually stop the disease.
Because the cell would still die anyway.
Exactly. But if the dying batteries are the root cause driving the cognitive decline, then theoretically, recharging those batteries should alleviate the symptom.
Which is an incredibly bold hypothesis to try and test. Because to prove causation, you can't just observe a declining brain. You have to actively intervene, right?
You do.
You have to find a way to artificially recharge the brain's internal batteries while the disease is in progress, and then literally measure if the memory actually comes back.
Right. The researchers needed to isolate that single variable. If they could force the mitochondrial activity to increase and the symptoms subsequently improved, well, it would strongly suggest that the energy impairment is the driver of the cognitive decline.
Rather than just a bystander.
Exactly.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because the obvious logistical question is, how do you jumpstart a microscopic battery inside a living, thinking brain?
It's not easy.
I mean, we're talking about something so small, you need an electron microscope just to see it.
You need a biological intervention. And the research teams, and they were drawing heavily on work they had previously published back in 2025, they developed a highly sophisticated tool. It involves utilizing something called G proteins.
Okay, let's break down G proteins for the listener. What are these proteins actually doing inside the cell?
Think of G proteins as the molecular switchboard operators within the cell.
Switchboard operators, okay.
Their job is to receive signals from outside the cell or from other internal compartments and then activate the appropriate cellular responses. They basically transfer information.
Got it.
And earlier research by this same team identified that specific G proteins play a critical central role in regulating just how much energy the mitochondria produce in the brain.
So they are like the supervisors on the factory floor, basically telling the power plant to either ramp up production or shut things down.
That is a very helpful way to visualize it. And knowing this mechanism, the researchers engineered an artificial receptor. They named it Mitochondria Gs.
Mitochondria Gs. It sounds like a bioweapon from a science fiction novel.
I know, the name is a bit complex, but its function is incredibly elegant. They designed this artificial receptor to be placed directly inside the mitochondria.
Inside the power plant itself.
Right. Its sole purpose is to interact with those G proteins from the inside. When the researchers trigger this artificial receptor, it commands the G proteins to activate, which in turn heavily stimulates the mitochondrial activity.
Wow.
It essentially forces the power plant into high gear on command.
I am going to push back on the clinical reality of this, though. Because it's one thing to engineer a biological jumper cable like this in a laboratory environment. But how do you actually install an artificial receptor into a living brain? I mean, you can't just swallow a pill and suddenly have new hardware inside your mitochondria.
That is a very important distinction to make. In these advanced animal models, specifically, they used mice in this study. Researchers use precise delivery methods. They often utilize harmless viral vectors to introduce the genetic code for this receptor directly into the target cells.
Oh, so they reprogram them.
Basically, they give the neurons the instruction manual to build this new switch inside their own mitochondria. And the mice they used were specifically bred or modified to exhibit the cognitive decline and memory loss that perfectly mimics neurodegenerative disease.
So they basically hack the mice's cells to build an override switch for their own energy production.
Yeah.
And then they flip the switch.
They did. And when they activated mitochondria Gs in the brains of these dementia model mice, the mitochondrial activity returned to completely normal levels.
And the ultimate result. Because if the hypothesis holds up, flipping that switch shouldn't just make the cell burn brighter, it should actually bring the memory back online, right?
Their memory performance measurably improved.
Wow.
Yeah, by simply restoring the cellular energy supply, the researchers were able to reverse the memory loss in these animals. To give you the exact weight of this finding, let me read a quote from the source.
Yeah, please.
This is from Giovanni Marsicano, an INSERM research director and co-senior author of the study. He stated, "This work is the first to establish a cause and effect link between mitochondrial dysfunction and symptoms related to neurodegenerative diseases, suggesting that impaired mitochondrial activity could be at the origin of the onset of neuronal degeneration."
The origin. Not a late-stage symptom, but the origin.
The very beginning.
That is a massive paradigm shift.
Right.
And I want to connect this directly to you, the listener, because anyone who has ever watched a loved one struggle with dementia or Alzheimer's, you know how agonizing the search for a viable treatment has been.
It's heartbreaking.
It really is. For the last 30 years, whenever we read about Alzheimer's research, the focus is almost exclusively on the physical buildup of junk in the brain.
Yes, the plaques.
Right? We hear about amyloid plaques, which are like sticky gunk building up between the cells, and we hear about tau tangles, which are like collapsing train tracks inside the cell.
And that dominant narrative, often referred to as the amyloid hypothesis, has been that clearing those plaques and tangles would stop the cognitive decline. Billions of dollars and decades of research have been poured into finding ways to remove that structural damage.
We've basically spent 30 years acting as cellular garbage collectors.
That's one way to put it, yeah.
We've been trying to invent better brooms to sweep up the plaques. But the clinical trials targeting those plaques, they haven't been the ultimate definitive silver bullets. I mean, some have shown modest slowing of the disease, but they aren't reversing the memory loss the way we all hoped.
Unfortunately not.
So this new research makes me wonder, should we have been electricians all along? Has science been looking at the wrong culprit?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it's not that the scientific community was completely wrong.
Go.
Plaques and tangles are undeniably a major destructive part of Alzheimer's pathology. But this breakthrough suggests we have been looking at an incomplete picture. We were heavily focused on the downstream damage, the smoke and the ash, basically.
While ignoring the fire.
Exactly. Not paying enough attention to the upstream failure that might have started the fire in the first place.
That makes perfect sense. And the article actually brings in some fascinating outside backing to show that this isn't just, one rogue study. It mentions a recent, highly significant study from the Mayo Clinic.
Right. The Mayo Clinic study provides a vital piece of corroborating evidence. They looked specifically at something called mitochondrial complex I.
Let's demystify that term real quick. What does complex I actually do?
So inside the mitochondria, energy is produced through a sequence called the electron transport chain. Think of it like a bucket brigade.
Okay, a bucket brigade.
Complex I is literally the first enzyme complex in that chain. It catches the raw materials derived from the food we eat and begins the process of transferring electrons to create an electrical current.
Got it.
If complex I is broken or disrupted, the first person in the bucket brigade drops the bucket. The whole energy production line just chokes.
And what did the Mayo Clinic find regarding complex I and Alzheimer's?
They found that disruptions in mitochondrial complex I were directly linked to the clinical progression of Alzheimer's disease. And furthermore, it actually impacted how patients might respond to potential treatments.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, reviews published subsequent to that study have increasingly described mitochondrial failure not as a late consequence of a dying brain, but as an early central feature of Alzheimer's biology.
So the power grid starts failing early on, and that failure might actually trigger the cascade that leads to the plaques, the tangles, and eventually the death of the cell. Etienne Hébert-Châtelet, a professor at the Université de Montaigne and one of the co-senior authors, he put it really well in the text. He noted that this new tool, the MitoDread-GIS, is going to help them identify the precise molecular and cellular mechanisms responsible for dementia. It gives researchers a literal map of the power grid.
And identifying that mechanism is the critical step toward developing a therapy, because the ultimate goal here isn't to insert artificial, genetically engineered receptors into human brains.
Right, that's just for the mice.
That is a lab technique. The goal is to understand exactly how the receptor triggers the energy boost so that pharmaceutical companies can design a drug, a pill, or an infusion that mimics that exact same effect safely in humans.
So what does this all mean? If you are listening to this right now and thinking, wow, this is incredible, how soon can my grandfather get this treatment? We really have to look at what comes next.
We do.
Because as amazing as this biological jumper cable is, the gap between a mouse model in a laboratory and a human clinic is notoriously vast.
This raises an important question, one we always have to ask when examining these striking medical breakthroughs. What are the caveats?
Yeah, what's the catch?
Well, a mouse brain, while sharing many biological fundamentals with us, is not a human brain. Translating a finding like this into a safe, durable, and effective human treatment is a monumental leap. It requires years of rigorous clinical trials.
And I would imagine safety is a massive concern here. You're talking about artificially manipulating the fundamental energy grid of the most important organ in the body.
It's risky.
If you overclock a computer processor to run faster than it was designed to, it generates too much heat and eventually burns out. Wouldn't forcing a damaged neuron to run at maximum capacity constantly risk burning out the cell even faster?
That is a highly relevant analogy, and it's a primary concern for the researchers. The initial phase of this study proved that a temporary boost restores memory. But neurodegenerative diseases are chronic conditions. They progress over years, even decades.
Right, it's not a quick fix.
Exactly. You cannot just jumpstart the battery once and expect a permanent cure.
So the researchers now need to know what happens if you basically leave the jumper cables attached.
Precisely. They need to investigate the long-term effects. Can continuous stimulation of the mitochondria do more than just temporarily clear the brain fog? Can it actually halt the progression of the disease entirely?
The source includes a really compelling quote on this from Luigi Bellocchio, another INSERM researcher and co-senior author. Let me pull that up. He said, "Our work now consists of trying to measure the effects of continuous stimulation of mitochondrial activity to see whether it impacts the symptoms of neurodegenerative diseases and ultimately delays neuronal loss or even prevents it if mitochondrial activity is restored."
And that statement encapsulates the dual hope of this entire field of research. In the short term, the hope is symptom management, giving people their memory, their clarity, and their dignity back by restoring the energy supply.
Yeah.
But the long-term ultimate hope is disease modification. If you keep the power on, can you prevent the structural damage from ever occurring? Can you save the hardware?
It is an incredibly hopeful trajectory. I mean, we started this deep dive with a stack of complex scientific literature. We waded through cellular biology, electron transport chains, and the microscopic anatomy of the brain. But when we distill it all down, we arrive at a remarkably simple, profound concept.
The fight against dementia is entering a completely new era, one that is shifting its focus toward the fundamental energy demands of our biology.
An era focused on recharging the brain's tiny engines. And the most striking takeaway for you, our listener, is this. Memory loss might not just be a narrative of inevitable structural death.
Right.
It is deeply tied to living, viable neurons that are simply running short on power. And if science can learn how to sustainably and safely recharge those engines, we are looking at a completely new path forward.
It moves the conversation from one of permanent deletion to one of potential rescue. And that shift in perspective alone is going to drive an enormous amount of innovation over the coming years.
It really is. Now, before we wrap up, we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something that builds on the incredible biology we've unpacked today. The article makes it abundantly clear that our brains consume a massive, disproportionate amount of our body's energy. It is a hungry machine.
Very hungry. It requires constant fueling just to maintain its baseline operations.
Right. So if cognitive decline, the loss of our very memories and our ability to think clearly, can be triggered simply because those brain cells are experiencing an internal energy crisis. What does that mean for how our daily lifelong habits impact our minds?
Oh, that opens up a fascinating angle on preventative care.
Think about it. We know how to train our physical stamina. We manage our diets, we engage in cardiovascular exercise, we optimize our sleep patterns, specifically to train how our muscles utilize energy. Sure, if the energy supply is the literal root of cognitive longevity, could we one day manage our brain's internal power grid the exact same way?
That's a great question.
Could the future of preventing dementia look less like taking a highly experimental drug and more like actively training and conditioning the mitochondrial stamina of our minds? It totally changes how you view a good night's sleep or healthy meal. Are you just resting, or are you actively charging the grid?
It certainly highlights the deeply interconnected nature of our systemic health and our cognitive longevity. How we fuel ourselves today might dictate how clearly we can remember tomorrow.
Something to ponder as you go about your day. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions, stay insanely curious, and we will catch you on the next one.